In this video, I'm going to show you an awesome response to when white tries to play this fried liver trick, going for this fork on our rook and our queen. I'll quickly run you through the moves. You start off with d5, intercepting this diagonal, and when they take, business as usual, we play the ridiculous looking b5. Now this just looks bad. Your opponents will surely just underestimate you, but this is one of the best weapons up against the fried liver. It scores so well for black at the beginner and intermediate levels. So I'll run you through a few of the basics, and then we'll take a look at one of Daniel Naroditsky's games, trying this off against another grandmaster. So I'll run you through the most common response for white if they're not a GM, and you'll see just why this opening is so good. So most players will take, it's a free pawn, and it looks awesome. I mean, this knight is pinned, it's being attacked by the pawn, but the resource we have is we recapture now with the queen, and it's a fork on this bishop, and also this g2 pawn, which is going to be a big problem for white in a lot of these lines we're going to see. So a lot of players will just take here, they're up a pawn, so they're just trying to get everything off the board, and we recapture with our queen. We're still hitting this g2 pawn, so a lot of players will castle, and then we fianchetto our bishop, setting up a checkmate threat. Now this is really difficult to respond to, and a lot of players go wrong here. The only move for white to not start getting crushed is to bring the queen out to f3, offering another exchange of queens, but a lot of players don't do that. Every other move, and the engine just plummets towards black. So we can see if you immediately jump the knight back, the problem is you can play it slow. You'll see the engine will just suggest something like queen slide castling, which is what you want to do almost all the time in this line. But you can play really aggressive and just start throwing your pawns forward. This is always the idea you want to think about, getting these pawns forward. If they don't drop back with their knight, let's just say they play f3. Well, first off, this diagonal is now really weak. So whenever we want, we have this check here that can be really annoying. But again, same game plan applies. You play h6, drop the knight back, and then play g5. Start playing really aggressively, and your opponent will not know what to do. So I'll show you one line where white just gets checkmated before they're even out of the opening. Let's just say they try and open up their dark squared bishop. You push g4. They can't take because of this pin. We're threatening checkmate on g2, so the knight has to drop back. We develop our bishop, stopping that bishop from blocking this diagonal. And if they just start developing just nonchalantly, we take the f-pawn, and if they recapture with the queen, you take the queen. We don't even need the queen to checkmate here, because when they recapture, this is mate in 3. You slide your rook over to the g-file. Remember this is always very important when you're attacking in this kind of style. The king moves over, and then it's checkmate right there with the bishop. So that is the most common type of game you will experience playing this opening. I'll quickly run you through the 3 other main responses you should know. So in this spot, we've just captured the pawn. We're attacking the bishop before white took our knight, but a very tempting move is for the knight to jump forward. It attacks our queen, it defends the bishop, but what white probably missed here is that g2 was hanging. So you definitely take this pawn, but just know this is going to be a crazy, chaotic game. First off, this knight is still under a lot of pressure. You can't forget that the queen still defends here. So even though we could take that knight, it is not what you want to do. Basically, the best move here for white is to bring their queen out, again, offering those queen trades. If they do that, you're just going to be in an equal game, no problem. But if they slide the rook over, you want to play aggressive, play g4, attack that queen, and then when they move the pawn back, you basically just argue that this king is super weak, it's stuck in the middle, this pawn push is not going to be good in the long run. You drop back, and now your position is still great, your queen is awesome. Now you're threatening to take this knight, and you're going to have a great game from here. So the next most common position you will get, we're going all the way back to when we've just played b5. Most players will take the pawn, but some won't. Some will first take the knight. Now this takes a lot of fun out of the position, sadly, but you can see that it is all zeros, all equal for black. So if you know what you're doing, you're going to be absolutely chilling into the middle game. The important thing to remember is you take back the bishop, and it's really difficult for white to win this pawn. It's very difficult for white to defend that pawn. So they just kind of have to agree that you're eventually going to win that back, and it's going to be a very equal game. I'll show you a quick line. Basically, if they play queen e2, trying to attack that pawn, also threatening this pawn, which you have to be careful of, the important move to remember is queen d5. The queen does everything here. It defends this pawn, defends that pawn, attacks that pawn as well, even attacks g2. It is the most multi-purpose move I think I've seen in a long time. White will mostly just castle here, and remember, don't take this pawn straight away. You've got to first defend this pawn, and in this spot, the best move for white from the engine is just to play b3. Basically accept that they're never going to win this pawn, they're never going to defend that pawn, and you're just going to have a great equal game from here. For the final variation, I'm going to show you a match of Daniel Naroditsky up against the GM Bortnik. Now, both these guys know the theory. This is the top engine line, but it's only seen about 4% of the time at the amateur level. So you're not going to see this much, but if you do, you know you're up against someone who knows their stuff, because the best move for the engine is dropping the bishop back all the way to f1, which just looks so lame. But basically the idea is that this knight has to move and this bishop will eventually come back and win this pawn. The move to remember here is to jump forward with your knight. Things don't work out very well if you take the pawn straight away with your queen, so don't worry about that. And then basically if our opponent just does nothing, just plays a random move, you want to play a6 and then you're absolutely chilling in this position. But most players will try and get rid of this knight. They'll push the pawn forward, and now here comes the fun in this match with Daniel Naroditsky. He doesn't play the best move. The best move is actually the interesting knight takes in the center, basically exposing this attack on the knight. But it's a similar idea. He attacks the knight. Oops, sorry. Let me play the move. He attacks the knight, and then we get a nice desperado from Bortnik. So a desperado tactic is when you know a piece is about to fall, you can basically sacrifice it for even more material before you make the necessary trades. So what Bortnik does here is he takes on f7, and the idea is this attacks the queen, so it comes with tempo. Black has to recapture, and now when Bortnik has recaptured in the center, he's up a pawn. So Bortnik, again, knows his stuff. It's not going to be easy for Daniel here, but you can see in this variation, Black is actually still doing fine. So even if your opponent knows the theory, if you remember that knight jumping forward and just remember this kind of counterattacking idea, you'll be able to equalize the game. So I just realized I am saying they're equal, but they're only equal if Black recaptures the D pawn here. Daniel actually decides to take with his queen, and if you remember, this just doesn't really end up very well in this variation. And you'll see why. The knight develops with tempo. The queen has to, well, in this case, drop forward rather than back in those situations we talked about earlier. But Bortnik picks up the pawn, and once the dust is all settled, basically Black is down a pawn, the king is weak, it's not looking great for Daniel right now. So we'll see Danya in this spot try and get compensation from lines we saw earlier in the video. He's going to fianchetto his bishop on this side, eyeing up that long diagonal and this weak pawn here. But Bortnik makes his king pay just being out in the open, throws in this check on b3. The king has to move forward, and now when the bishop just drops back, basically this pawn is untouchable because of this pin, eventually, if the rook were to slide over with the king. So Daniel's got some compensation, but it's not great. He decides to actually sack the bishop here, thinking that this is potentially a checkmate threat, but the problem is the king can just walk over. So Bortnik just gets the free piece. So I made this situation we just saw into a puzzle on chessblueprints.com. Check it out if you want to improve your chess skills. You can see here we've got a choice. Should we do what Danya did and sacrifice our bishop or just defend it? I think we'll just defend it, and you can see that was the right move. It was the top engine move. Danya should have just taken his time. So going back to the game, the engine might be unconvinced. It defends like an absolute monster, but these two are playing bullet, and this isn't going to be easy for Bortnik. Daniel takes with check, the king moves over, and now the rook slides in, getting involved into the attack, lining up with this king, and with Bortnik with low time, this is going to be difficult to deal with. He tries to get a queen trade, but Daniel just runs away, certainly does not want to trade queens here. Bortnik brings his rook into the action, and Daniel starts to running his king away. Again, this is the big problem. That sacrifice maybe could have been sound if this king was tucked away nice and safe, but you can see it is very exploitable. We get a check here. Daniel tries to run another check. Daniel runs back. Bortnik decides instead now to open up this pawn, try and get this bishop involved with the attack, but it allows Daniel to develop with tempo here on the queen. The queen throws in this check, drops back, and now Bortnik runs his king away from the d-file because Danya is starting to crash through. Wants to open up some lines. Bortnik recaptures, the knight jumps forward, and now here comes a mistake from Bortnik. He first throws in this check. This makes sense. This isn't the mistake. The king slides over, and then he runs in with this bishop sacrifice. Now this bishop sacrifice just doesn't work, and it was just a bit unneeded. Bortnik was still up a piece. His king was relatively safe, although you can't blame him for thinking he had to do something drastic here soon. And maybe what he missed is his queen is just calmly defending that pawn backwards. So Danya can just ignore it. He just takes the knight, decides the knight was a better defender. Bortnik throws in this intermediate check with the bishop. So Danya has to go back. It looks like we're heading towards a queen trade, but Bortnik first throws in this check, not wanting that queen trade straight away. Danya has to slide over. It's a check. So now we finally get that queen trade, but there's still problems in the position. This bishop is hanging, so that's why we see this check thrown in. The knight is also hanging, so it's very messy at the moment. Basically, because of this situation, Danya has to sacrifice the exchange. It's because if he does nothing, he's just going to lose this knight and be down that whole piece again. So at least getting in this exchange, he can get his knight away, and now he is in exchange down, but has a pawn in compensation. Bortnik also has this open file, so that's why you see the engine thinks white is doing amazing, but the most important factor here is Danya has a significant time edge, and there's no increment. So that's going to explain the next few moves. Bortnik jumps down, takes the pawn, we get a check, king has to move, and when the bishop drops back, Bortnik decides to first throw in that check, and then just trade off the bishop. Bortnik wants to just simplify the game a bit so that he can just play a little bit quicker. But the problem is that with this knight, there's always going to be these annoying checks, and that can really throw you out and make it hard to pre-move, hard to win in these low time situations. And you can see, this is already an example. Daniel just throws in this check, maybe not even a useful check, but just a check trying to get in the way, make him lose a bit of time. King has to move back, we recapture, and now we have this interesting position. We have a ton of passed pawns for white and a single rook up against a knight. It's very equal at the moment, but it's strange. I think as well because this king is so active for black, it can do a lot of effort to stop these pawns on the king side. So I'll quickly run you through the last moves because I think Bortnik is just pre-moving everything at this point. He takes the pawn. I think Daniel is also just pre-moving with this knight, relatively safe, just jumping around, being annoying. But Bortnik doesn't realize that he actually just loses his rook here. So it's a one-move blunder that loses him the game. Danya takes and eventually wins the game from here. But you can see, I think it was because that position was so complicated. Even though the engine didn't love Daniel's position at all, he was able to build that time edge, and that helped him win the game in the end. So as an extra bonus for making it near the end of the video, I've got a match of my own using this opening. And it's an interesting one. So I queue up Bullet. It's about 1500. I'm following the lines we talked about. And then he plays Bishop F1, which was so lame because, again, I'm seeing he knows the theory. This is only meant to happen 5% of the time. But I just followed the Danya game, jumped the knight forward, and I remembered the best move here. We remember Danya played H6, but I sacrifice the knight here, opening up this bishop, regaining that pawn. And you can see this is actually all still book. So this is probably the most book moves I've ever played in my life. But here comes a mistake from me. The best move was just to slide over with the king. But you'll see these games are fun. Even if you don't get the best position, you can see it's plus 1.4 for white. He comes out with the queen. He even gets in, but we have all these complications. My queen is jumping in here as well. And we get this F-file. Suddenly you'll see his king starts to get into a bit of trouble. And he makes a big blunder here. He takes my knight. I recapture. He gets excited thinking there's a free pawn. But, and this was a theme of the Bortnik game as well, this queen defends backwards. So I take his queen. We get a few moves here. I throw in this check, and then a nice end to the game. I get this rook sacrifice because I'm looking for checkmate on d2, and our opponent allows it. So let me know in the comments if you try out this opening. I'm keen to hear how it works out for you. Remember to check out chessblueprints.com to try out those puzzles and improve your chess. But if you're just staying on YouTube, you can check out the video above me. YouTube thinks you'll enjoy it, and I hope they're right. That being said, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.